Could you all just pull your cards out and put them back in, please? Again, please. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Lou, your one's not registering. Could you just pull yours out again, or we'll swap you out? No, are we right? Yeah, no, we're right now. Thank you, Lou. Deputy Mayors, where is she? I can't see her. Oh, Alicia, could you just do yours again? Thanks. Couldn't see. Are we right now? Okay, yes, thank you. Okay, we've got the technology sorted, so welcome everybody to the Finance and Audit Committee meeting of the 26th of May. I am not aware of any apologies. Is there any? No? Oh, sorry, I need to do the health and safety first. So the health and safety procedures are up on the screen. In case of emergencies, please follow the green exits and follow the administration staff at the front. Evacuation is out by the clock tower, and there's a defibrillator on the front house, and hopefully we won't require that today. And please report any incidents to the staff. So, and they're on the screen, so please take note. I have no notifications of additional items. Are there any declarations of interest? I'm not aware of any. Public comment? I'm not aware of any. And I don't see any members of the public. So we will now move on to the confirmation of the minutes. I'm happy to move the minutes. Is there a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Naylor. Any comment on the minutes? None. So we will vote. Thank you. And that is carried 16 votes for with 1 abstention. Right, we now move on to item number 6, which is the assurance report on review of COVID-19 expenditure. And we have Masuma presenting that report, so ready when you are, Masuma. And that's on page 13.
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy for the review report itself to be taken as read and take any questions through you, Madam Chair.
Okay, that's fine. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Masuma. Look, I just want a little bit of clarity just around the software, telephony software, which sits, I think, in that 925,000 IT spend. So I just really want to know what portion of that was for the telephony software, and in terms of business continuity planning in the future, what is likely to be the cost of resolving that as we go forward?
Perhaps I'll help Masuma out with that one. The 925 in IT expenses is not just the telephony. So the bulk of that cost is actually in the purchase of equipment, laptops, phones and the like, to get everybody working from home. The telephony one, 112, I'm reliably told, for the system. Now that was because we needed the technology to get the people out of this building. So for a long time during the lockdown, we were bringing people into the building on level 2. And that allowed people to answer the phone using a laptop and a headphones from home. In terms of the second part of your question, I might defer that to Patrick.
Through you, Madam Chair. So there's a review currently ongoing into the contact centre, and you might recall, I think it's 2 months ago, we had the IT disaster recovery report come here, and one of the actions in that was around the network. In fact, the significant action that is around the network redesign to make sure we've got a more resilient platform. Work on that is underway. It's due to complete in September of this year, which is as per the original plan. And at that stage, that will give us greater ability to separate the contact centre technology from the rest of the organisation technology, so as we can have more resilient business continuity plan for the contact centre.
Great, thanks, Madam Chair.
Okay. Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Suma, could I just ask 2 questions? We've got consultancy services of over 300,000 and advertising of 60,000. Bearing in mind we were in lockdown for most of that time, what consultants would we be using and what advertising would we be doing?
I can answer that for you. We used a number of consultants during that period. Some we had to bring in some additional communication support because we actually only had, I think, 3 people working in that area at the time, and they were all within the emergency at Te Awanui and otherwise busy on that. You will know yourselves that you received regular communication, as did the staff, as did the media, as did all our stakeholders. We also had within that staff wellbeing support. We also had legal advice. Our advertising was things around our parks being closed, whether toilets were available, public toilets, etc., etc. So this wasn't about promoting people coming to the city or anything like that. This was all around our response to COVID.
Through you, Madam Chair, could I just ask, I was actually asking Ms. Suma, but the CE answered it. So, through you, Madam Chair, so if we've got staff at home, shouldn't they be doing this work? I just can't understand where we've got consultants.
I'll ask the CE to answer that.
Yes, we get people to do the work who are skilled and experienced to do the work. We didn't have people at home available to do that.
Thank you. Any further questions, Mr Mayor? Okay, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Ms Suma, for the report. I want to focus on the 99% of welfare expenditure which was recovered, which is really, really good. But I see it only gets a line in the report, and there must have been some positive learnings from how that was achieved that we want to take forward. So I know the report focuses on IT expenditure and procurement, that maybe it's in where we could have improved things, but clearly things went really well in the welfare side. And has that good practice been captured, I suppose, going forward?
Yes, unfortunately with audit reports and learnings, they're normally improvement-based and where we can make improvements, but it was such a success with the welfare that I didn't want to just ignore it completely, so I did want to acknowledge that in the report. I do believe that those learnings have been captured by the Risk and Resilience Division and that they are going to be working on that going forward as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mr Armstrong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question, Suma, is around the IT software expenditure, the telephony software expenditure, and I was interested to know whether or not the vendor had any responsibility in relation to our purchasing of a solution which was not technically employable beyond COVID. And was there any discussion about cost recovery?
Would somebody else like to answer that? Patrick?
Again, through you, Madam Chair. My understanding at the time was clearly the Council, like many organisations in New Zealand at the time, was trying to move quickly, having some assumptions but no certainty on what the duration of the lockdown would be. Therefore, there was significant priority given to finding a technology solution that would enable business continuity through a fully remote service. There was not the vendor market scanning that was done in that time frame revealed that there was not a single cloud service that would be compatible inside the organization, i.e. for us to use on-premise and off-premise. And it's clear from the documents that I've looked at since I came in that there was consideration taken by the decision makers at the time around the financial benefit of securing a service for a year, again, not knowing how long lockdown was going to last, versus the significant additional cost we would have borne as a kind of casual month-by-month basis. And it was on this basis that the decision was taken to secure the capability for a 12-month period, make sure that the investment costs that we did have to make to apply to make sure the system could work, we were getting maximum benefit from. And I think it's fair to say that although the lockdown was probably shorter than we had initially envisaged it might be, aspects of that technology have continued to be used through this year, which has prevented us from buying additional workforce management software through the period. So in summary, I would say, recognising the large number of unknowns, it's clear to me from looking at the paperwork that the people taking the decisions tried to secure best value for money, whilst also making sure that we weren't operating on a month-by-month ad hoc basis for something that could have been much longer.
Look, thanks for that. I guess I wasn't really questioning the speed or the diligence of our team. I was really questioning the diligence of the software vendor, and I would have thought that most software vendors should be able to tell you quite quickly if your infrastructure will support the system that they're looking to sell you. And I accept that there are a number of complexities around that, so it was just a thought, really.
And again,
Just sorry, Patrick, but I'll pass to CFO.
Yeah, I wonder if I can help, because I was potentially one of those decision makers that's been talked about. At the time, the focus was almost entirely on getting people out of this building, and so there wasn't a lot of consideration given to the future beyond that. That was the point of the decision, and so therefore the software vendor helped us to do that, but in terms of decision-making processes, it wasn't really made as a long-term permanent solution decision at the time.
Okay, thanks for that. That's great. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Masuma, for the work that's gone into this report. Just wanted to ask a little bit about it in terms of the way it sits relative to the next report. The next report has a set of agreed actions and sort of action plan at the end of it. This one really just gives us a picture and says some learnings have been identified. Can you just help us understand how those learnings have been captured and what actions are expected to arise?
Yes, absolutely. So this is obviously the report that's come here, but we have got more detailed actions that have been developed alongside the risk and resilience and other functions, IT for instance as well. Those have been reported to ELT as they are at an operational level, and so they will be followed up and reported to them as well, so they will be chasing those.
Thank you.
The next one, of course, was per the approved, sorry, I just can't carry on the answer. The next report that's coming through was per the approved audit plan. And so obviously those actions will be reported to you and they will be followed up, and the follow-up reporting will also be to yourselves.
Yeah, great. Thank you for clarifying, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms Suma, just to follow up from that, on page 17 there's a recommendation that a list of roles be developed and approved, etc. So has this been taken on board by the ELT, and will that be coming back to us?
Do you mean the list of roles that should have delegated
yes,
authority?
Yes, because it's a process.
I don't think it needs to come back to elected members. I believe that Chief Executive has the delegated authority to approve those.
Sorry, I'll rephrase. Is that going to be actioned?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
No, that's fine. Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms Suma, for the report. I have already got half of the answer to my question, but do we know the exact amount we spent on that telephony software? It's not in the list.
We do. It's $112,000 of the $945 that's on your report.
All right, thank you. And my second question, you said that the Information Management Division is trying to find a suitable use of that extra equipment. So how big is the resource or how many of the equipments we have? And do we have any staff who don't have these things at the moment? If we are still thinking who can use this?
Patrick.
Madam Chair, approximately 100 laptops were bought during COVID that don't meet the specifications for our staff to use them on site. And again, we've got to keep in perspective here, this was a very compressed piece of time, and the urgency was around enabling short-term work. We are very clear on what specifications we need. We absolutely got as many of the specification that we can use, that we could, and the remainder, which again is approximately 100, there's no use for by staff inside this council because the specifications of them are too low. We are working through what appropriate utilisation of those might be, recognising that there's some financial accounting mechanisms for what we can and what we can't do with 100 laptops. And we are exploring things such as avenues such as through the library and the community development group to see if there are avenues where they can be effectively used, because they don't benefit anyone sitting on a shelf. And so that is actively underway.
Thank you. That was helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Mikola.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Musuma, for the report. And I note that you have mentioned here on page 16, first paragraph, that that there's less visibility of a supplier's delivery and the ability to ensure correct control procedures were followed. And I understand that, during the pandemic, this is what a lot of organizations had to go through and that sort of things. If we try to touch base with our suppliers to sort of request milestone reports on what was delivered during that time, or if we try to renegotiate, let's say, service outcomes to ensure that, the delivery of what we contracted for was actually delivered during that time?
It's a difficult one to answer because we deal with several suppliers, and obviously but I don't know the answer to that.
Someone else want to pick that one up, or?
I think the answer there is that we actually returned back to normal pretty quickly. And so we don't appear to have issues around shortage of supply and suppliers not being able to deliver stuff that I can see right now. That's a different conversation to the level of resource we've got available in terms of contractors to deliver service, but I don't think that that's necessarily related to the breakdown, that's just related to the economy in general. And so a short answer, and hopefully I'm answering how you expect, is that business returned to normal pretty quickly, and when purchases were required going forward on the return, there was really business as normal.
Yeah. Now, the reason why I'm asking this is because, in my line of work, I deal a lot with contracting and drafting contracts. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I knew that some suppliers were not able to deliver stated service outcomes because they couldn't probably deliver this face-to-face, and some of them had to move to remote learning and that sort of things. And what had ended up happening was that we had to renegotiate and sort of reevaluate those service outcomes and either heighten the expectation or lessen the expectation due to the pandemic. And the reason why I'm asking this is because we could have another outbreak. And given that we don't have any visibility, I just wanted to find out whether we have, quality control assurance to ensure that, or contingency plans to ensure that we have visibility over such things.
The answer is nothing's come to my attention.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. There's no one else in the queue. So thank you, Ms. Suma. You may step down. I'm happy to move the report. Is there a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Johnson. I'll open up for any comments. I think we've had 2 or 3 of these reports, so this is really just the final wrap-up, and I think again, it was an unusual event, so I think all the questions that we've asked has been answered fairly, and we go back to the fact that we were very, very lucky to come through this with the costs as they were, so well done to the staff. So we'll now move on to our next item. Oh, sorry, we do need to vote. Apologies. Well, so shocked that there was no questions. So we'll now vote. I asked for comment. That's why I was, yeah. No one was in the queue, so we're now voting. And that's passed unanimously. We now move on to item number 7, which is the assurance report on the review of the community grants and events funding. And we have Masuma again. And Cheryl, the acting GM, was there as well. Right, over to you when you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Happy to take this report as read as well and take any questions through yourself.
Okay, thank you. So over to you, councillors. Are there any questions? Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I'm just flicking. That was very speedy, Masuma. You caught me on the hop. I had a couple of questions. First, in your report, which I have now lost, you talk about funds and grants administered externally and how those are outside the scope of this review. But the current settings you recommend need to be reviewed and documented. I wanted to ask how that would happen. So that's on page, I found it, is it 24? Yes, page 24, bottom of, funds and grants administered externally. Recommended that the current settings be reviewed and formally documented.
Oh, okay, so the detailed behind that, I guess, is referring to page 28, 3B. Is that what you're referring?
Yes.
Yes? Cool. So I think it's just a matter of checking what those current settings are, whether they're still viable. I mean, there's obviously the choice that we say that they've got the history there and they're familiar with everything. It's just a matter of documenting it onto a piece of paper and making sure that the decision-making process has been documented.
So it's not about whether that's an appropriate process in itself.
It would be part of the consideration, so that would be considered. So you might say it's appropriate or you might say it's not and then go from there, but I wouldn't really know where each of those would land at this point, but that is definitely one of the options you'd consider.
So when you say we'd consider, you mean elected members? You don't mean that's an internal process?
No, internally, sorry. When I say you, sorry, I do mean staff, officers.
So elected members wouldn't be involved in deciding whether the externally administered funds and grants was an appropriate process?
If I can assist here, I think really what this report is saying that there are some events that are outside the scope. There hasn't been any documentation as to what will happen with them. It's hard to actually tell or give an answer to that until we've gone through the process of documenting them. And so I think once we've actually gone through that process, we can probably report back informally to you and the results of that process.
Thank you. So will this work be linked to the work that came through community development last week, which included these funds that are out of scope here within the scope of that piece of work? How will these things be tied together? We've got something that's out of scope here, but in scope there.
So the only reason they're out of scope here is because the review's purpose was to look at the administration process. And so because these are administered externally, we couldn't look at I don't think we should be looking at their processes. And that's what we mean by out of scope, but we still looked at the decision-making process that we make internally and then the accountability procedures that we have in place for them. So those elements were still in scope for all of those. And when we looked at the decision-making processes for them, there was just a lack of documentation that was noted. So it was hard to comment on whether we had followed good practice or not.
Thank you for that. I had a question about major events, which you talk about in exceptions to standard process 2A on page 26. And you two exceptions where the normal process had not been complied with. I just wondered if you could expand on those two examples, please, to help us understand why they challenged the standard process.
Sure. In the first instance, of course, we have a process called Smarty Grants, and the applications, that should be the first point of call, or officers should be the first point of call, but it's appeared in this case that a verbal agreement had been made before that Smarty Grants had been accessed, and therefore that's the deviation from standard process there. In the second instance, the standard process requires that an applicant should only be approved if they meet the criteria, but because that criteria had not been met and they had still approved it, that's where, from an audit point of view, that there was an exception.
Okay, thank you for that. And my last question was about development of an events policy, which is one of your recommendations, and you scope that as covering major events and Palmy Unleashed. But obviously events happen under lots of other funds, so would the events policy deliberately not speak to events that happen through, say, celebrating communities or creative communities?
One of the discussions we've had, which is why I think we reported recently around the community funding policy, was to actually broaden that community funding policy to actually encapsulate all grants that council administers, so it becomes a grants and funding policy rather than just focused on community, so that we actually have a policy that covers all grants and a consistent, transparent process that covers all grants, so that we're consistent across the whole.
So that grants and funding policy will connect with this events policy to have a joined up piece of work, become one. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Masuma and Cheryl. I've got two questions again. On page 26, you said that some of the events were not adequately documented. Can you elaborate? What do you mean by not adequately documenting?
Yes, sure. So for those events, we have a process in place that we follow, but when we went to review them, we couldn't cite a documented process, a flow chart, for example, or something that just shows what that process is, so that if some staff member leaves one day, there is something that the next person can pick up for handover, or otherwise, if we go to do a review, we can actually say, this is what the approved process is, and the actual process in place is consistent.
All right, thank you. And my second question is almost the same question Councillor Bowen has just asked. On the same page, can I ask where did this political pressure came? Was it within the council or outside the council to approve something which was not following the standards?
I think the important word in that statement is perceived political pressure. Mm-hmm. I think the pressure it really depends. It's just what was noted on the I'll let Cheryl answer that one.
I think probably it's not a sort of appropriate place to really sort of go into the detail of who. I think this report's really about the process and the systems and how we can improve the processes. So I'm not really, I'm not sort of willing to actually name and shame in this environment.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Masuma. Can I just ask why there isn't contracts? I mean, surely there should be contracts, even if there are a revolving wheel of staff coming and going. If we're giving money out, there should be some paper trail, at least. Shouldn't there?
Could I just clarify the question? What do you mean by contract? With who?
So if we've got an event, there will be somebody will have applied somehow, and there'll be some paper trail. Because you're saying here in some of the commentary, there was no paper trail, there was verbal. There must be a paper trail. Is it just lacking paper trails?
This report's really referring to the paper trail around the process in the system. So it's not talking about the paper trail around contracts. As far as I'm aware, that we do have contracts for our events, and that was tidied up some time ago. This is about the process.
Okay, so we do have a paper trail.
So we have a contract that we end up signing when we give the money over,
Yep.
but we don't have a paper trail to show how we got to that contract point or how that decision was made. Or there might be a paper trail, but it's not the standard process that one would have followed for the what the standard process was.
In Smarty grants. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, and there's some processes before and after Smarty Grant, so obviously that's a starting point, but then
Yeah.
there's actually an approval process that goes in the middle of, or subsequent to that.
Okay. Okay, that's slightly different to what's all been reported here, but at least that's now clearer. And I'm just trying to get to the bottom of what is actually broken with some of the stuff. So it's the process that you're questioning here of how we make a grant.
Allocate a grant, yes.
Okay, and at the end, so we have the process. Somebody comes and says they've got a major cycling event or something. It comes either via my office or it goes to the offices. Is that the process that's not clear? I'm trying to figure out what's broken here.
Yes.
Okay, all right. So then the contract is somebody agrees, officers agree that this is the right thing to do. A contract is drawn up, and then money is whatever has happened is paid out, and then is at the back end that's not clear as well, like the reporting. Is that what's wrong?
I think what the review's trying to communicate, the report's trying to communicate, is that when we have a standard process, obviously we apply a consistent approach to all applicants. And when we go and do a review, we check that approach has been applied consistently across all the applications that we randomly select. But what we found was when a couple of instances, of course, where we've noted the exceptions, that approach wasn't applied as per every other application, and so there's just inconsistency then in the process. So if it does go through a particular office or if it goes through Smarty Grants, it's just a matter of making sure that we end up going through the same administration and approval process in the end.
Okay. If I could ask one more question. So that leads me to the second part. So Smarty Grants, is that the only portal that could be used? And I say that because if I'm, say, running a very small community event, I have to do the same work as if I was asking the council for $100,000. So is there, and you've identified a few issues there. So when Smarty Grants was selected, were there any other opportunities to look at other portals? Or was it just one size fits all?
Going back to sort of how the process was, how we actually chose Smarty Grants, I can't really go into that detail because it's quite some time ago and I wasn't intimately involved, but I was involved around the edges. But I know that there was quite a hard look at what other councils were doing and what other councils were using. We have had some internal discussions with the applications around Smarty Grants to make sure that the documentation required for applications is fit for purpose, and we do recognise that there's different sized grants that are applied for, and so it's important that they are fit for purpose. I would say about the process that we will need to look at in terms of implementing these recommendations will be from way to go, right from when they make an inquiry through to when the decision's made. So it will cover the whole process from start to end. This is sort of not unlike what we did with the community grants several years ago, when we actually found that we needed to put in some transparent processes, and they took some time to get modification and improvements on the way through, and we did some audits on those community grants. The events grants, or those grants that are sitting outside, those are fairly recent new additions to the grants program. So it's really approaching these grants in the same way that we did with the community grants, and making sure that we have clear, transparent
Sorry, Madam Chair, I
processes.
didn't ask that. I asked about, was Smarty grants I didn't ask about
I think that's been answered.
No, I beg to differ, that's fine.
Okay. Have you got anything to add to that, Cheryl, or not? Okay, no, that's... Any further questions, Mr Mayor? Okay. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Ms. Emma, for this report. 2 questions that I had. The first was, in your work, were you able to estimate how much administrative effort goes into these grant-making processes?
No, I wasn't.
Just might ask through you, Madam Chair, if we could get a response as to whether we know how much administrative effort goes into this?
Does anybody have that information here?
Do you mean time-wise, or?
Yes.
Yes, no.
That's right, thank you. I can follow that up offline. The second question was around, you talked about protecting the decision makers by documenting the process. And I think that was referring to the process of those specific grant awards. Do we have any visibility of whether that same good practice is exercised by the organizations that provide that service for us externally? Because you talk about subsequent accountability measures for those external bodies, and I'm just wondering if part of those subsequent accountability measures includes confirming the quality of the process that they're running and whether it's sufficient to protect their decision makers.
No, that's not something that we had checked as part of the accountability, or it's not part of the accountability at this point in time.
Great, thank you for clarifying that, Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Ms Emma and Cheryl. I've just got a question around the recommendations, key findings and recommendations 1C. And I just want to check that my interpretation of that paragraph is correct. So you identify that there isn't any kind of big picture reporting on whether or not the grants have achieved their purpose and whether or not they're contributing adequately to goals and strategies. Are you envisaging that a report would come back, for example, with reference to the Connected Communities strategy, talking about where grants had contributed to that strategy and if there were any gaps? Is that the sort of thing you mean? No. Okay.
No, not that. So you are receiving some reporting on an individual basis for these grants. Basically, what we're suggesting is we put all of those together into one report and give you a more holistic overview of what's happening across the board in a timely manner, of course, so that you can actually use that information when you're setting the budgets for the following year.
So, okay, thank you. So if we wanted to be informed prior to, let's say, the next 10-year plan discussion as to whether or not we had an adequate amount of funding in the community sector, because the strategic priority grants are primarily what we use to achieve a lot of the strategic outcomes in that goal, what kind of reporting could we expect to help us make that decision? Would this reporting that you're proposing here help with that? Or would we need additional reporting?
I'm actually going to, I'm looking to see if Julie can help me out with this one. I think it would contribute, but I'm not sure that it actually would be the report that you would be looking for. But I'll,
well, if I just give a bit of background. So one of the issues that I have discovered in discussions around funding envelopes for community outcomes in the long-term plan is that it's very hard for us as elected members to know whether the size of the fund is adequate to achieve the aims that we're wanting it to achieve. So at what stage could we have, at what stage would we be getting some reporting on that, or is that an additional report that we need to ask for, I suppose? That's what I'm asking.
I think to be able to influence the budgeting process and decision-making process that you go through, you would need to have a report on that around August in terms of the lead-in to the long-term plan. And I think that would be a specific report.
So we'd need to ask for that specifically?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Mr Armstrong.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the report. My question's around peer review, and it is, I guess, the comment that Councillor Barrett made earlier about one of the purposes of this review is to ensure that the processes are being followed and that decision makers are being protected. I note that one of the recommendations is in relation to removing one peer review, and I just would like to understand how peer reviews are used. Do they apply to all of the decisions around the different funds? How is the reviewer selected? Is it an independent person? Could you just provide a little bit more detail around that, please?
I'll start, and if I can't answer, I'll pass it on to someone who can. Peer review, in that instance, we are only suggesting that we cut it down because there's one person that's administering it and doing the first initial approval, and then we have two other people that do independent peer review. So in that case, it did seem like there was more than necessary, and that's why we suggested that you have one approver and one peer reviewer that also reviews it. But across the other grants, I think there is sufficient personnel involved in the approval process to allow for peer reviews as well. So it's not called a peer review as such, but there are panels that approve it, so there is more than one person involved in every decision.
So every decision is made either by a panel or is peer reviewed by a person independent from the decision?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Harpeter.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for this process. It's great to see some transparency. When looking at major events that come to the city, sometimes they come in a flurry and there is quite a lot of hype around them in terms of trying to attract the event to the city. I'm just looking at 2A and trying to understand that process, and I know the Mayor tried to tease that out, and then looking at the recommendation that is around that. My question is around the exception and around the recommendation that goes with it. So just the example that's given, I'm trying to get to the question, sorry, Madam Chair. It's really around someone coming in and wanting to put, a $2 million event into the city, and basically that's gone to the Mayor, and this recommendation saying that was a verbal contract, and this recommendation saying that no, that can't happen. So I'm trying to understand how that process can happen when that event needs to come to the city because of the bed nights that will come out of that. I'm just really struggling with this process.
If I can answer that from sort of an operational side of things, I think if there's an event like a $2 million event or a really huge sort of catalyst event for the city, that would be something that would actually be brought to council, is what I would envisage.
Any further questions, Councillor?
Can we have that reflected in the document then? Because I feel like this is black and white, and you're putting it right in front of us as a black and white document as a process. So I think it needs to be reflected as a process, because that's what you're putting in front of us now.
I think it would be reflected through the change control framework that would be developed, because the reality of life is there's always going to be exceptions, and there's always going to be times that you do need to bypass the standard process. But you need to have a framework that tells you how you can bypass that process. And obviously the Chief Executive would be the one that's approving it, but what that might suggest is there's an exception, you want to bypass the entire process, let's take it to the particular committee or through the chamber and get that approved That's an edit, that's
Oh,
an
right up
extreme
a
bit.
recommendation.
Mr Mayor. Oh, sorry, were you saying you're going to write a recommendation? I think this is going to be part of the process, that this will be, it's part of the process, councillor, that it will be picked up. It's in the recommendations.
Oh, sorry, Madam Chair, this is sort of related to that. So can I just understand if, because the recommendation here says that we just accept, we receive for information this report. But this report, it's not totally clear. This report has a whole lot of recommendations, which some I don't agree with, and I don't want to cherry pick it. But so if we just, I'm quite happy to approve the report, but does that mean all these recommendations are locked in and officers now do everything? Is that what we're doing?
Cheryl, I'll ask you to answer that, please.
So what happens from here is that, yes, it is then our responsibility to enact these recommendations.
That's all I need to know. Thank you.
Okay. So is your question answered also, Mr Mayor? So, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to clarify that the actions that you've got in here that, as you've just said, Cheryl, that you'll undertake are going to be reported back through the regular reporting to this committee in about 6 months' time.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions, councillors? Right, there are none. I'm closing off. Right. We will now move the thank you. You may step down. Thank you both. Somebody like to move the recommendations? Thank you, Councillor Naylor, and thank you, Councillor Johnson. Now open for comments. Are there any comments? Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, councillors, look, there's nothing wrong with doing this, and it's good practice, it's transparency. But we are, as councillors, we're just extinguishing all our responsibility to the officers. That's essentially what we're doing. So if we have an officer that doesn't like XYZ event, it can get hidden within a process. We've seen that yesterday with Pacific Fusion. It's not funded. I had no idea. You had no idea. So there's an example of how, slightly different, but how things get lost in translation. So I do think there needs some more checks and balances need to be had, and I am really struggling with what is exactly broken here. Are we trying to boil the ocean? I get that there's some documentation missing around the process, and there's been high staff turnover in the unit, but is that our problem? I think that would be more of a management process. Look, major events in Palmy Unleashed, they're quite unique in the sense that Palmy Unleashed should be quick, happens all the time. That's what it was designed for. This will, and look, I've had many comments come to me because they just struggle with the Smarty Grants process, where you have to give so many different traffic management plans, marketing plans, this, that and that, and they get $500. It is honestly over the top. So there does need to be one size fits all does not work in this case. That's a bit of a side issue. But just coming back to the specifics, if something comes into us and it needs it's either competitive with another city, example for that may be something like the New Zealand Rural Games. Do we go through the whole big process, possibly? Or does it come through, there's always got to be paperwork and contracts. That's why I teased out that there are contracts exist, that there is a reporting line. So we will give away quite a lot of say in what goes on. Now, I don't want to bring everything back into the chamber if we've got what I call an event. An example is the World Softball Champs. Yes, that may come back into the chamber, but I don't want to bring in every single little event because we have a disagreement with an officer. This will happen, believe me, if you approve this. You're extinguishing all your responsibility to the officers, and I believe we should still have some form of say in what events are run in the city. So I won't be supporting it. Not that I don't support the work that's been done, but it's gone so far in terms of the recommendations And I would prefer, Madam Chair, that we accept this report and it comes back again to us with a little bit more understanding of what those actual recommendations are, because there's quite a number hidden amongst all of this, and I really fear for Sport Manawatu and Environment Manawatu who will have everything taken off them as well. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My comments relate specifically to how we are setting up good process, whether that process includes elected members or not, but setting up good process to protect decision makers wherever they sit, whether they sit around this table or in the organization. And concerned that we need to make sure as soon as possible that we're extending that effort towards good practice to the external organizations that make decisions with money that ultimately is money that comes through council and is funded by the community. I think that we need to ensure that all the decision makers, whether they sit inside of council or outside, have good process documentation, and that we have assurance at this table that all those organizations have that in place. That was the main point that I wanted to raise, but have appreciated the concerns that the mayor's raised around some of the wider implications of what's being put before us today, Madam Chair.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the officers for the report, which I do think drilled into some areas that we've not had good lines of sight on through this chamber, and I think has been very useful. I don't think we should be surprised that there is some tension in this space. I think you only have to read the submissions to the long-term plan to know that we've made decisions that have impacted on funding lines, and that has sometimes unintended consequences. So I'm particularly pleased with recommendation 1C about a yearly report coming back. I think we won't know if that meets our needs actually until we see it, and at that point elected members will be able to give direction for future reports coming back. But there's certainly a question that's been in my mind about how the performance of our grants meets our strategic direction, and whether the quantum of funding is right, and we've all made attempts at that over the years through the long-term plan process, but sometimes you feel like you're flying blind, and I feel like this kind of reporting will help us in that. I was particularly interested in recommendation 3A about event funding contracts, giving greater specificity about the roles and responsibilities of the council and the contracted party. So, for example, I was interested to learn recently that where council funds an event, we will not publicise that event unless we've specifically said so in the contract, because there's a value to our marketing work. So you'd think it would make sense that if council was funding an event, we'd publicise it, but that should not be taken for granted unless it's specified in the contract. And I think that has been something that has entirely missed our contracting organisations sometimes. There's been an assumption, and the job of business assurance is to challenge those assumptions and get our documents in the right place. So I'm certainly very supportive of that. I think the Mayor's highlighted absolutely accurately that sometimes there isn't a budget for something we want to do, and there needs to be a process to get that decision made. The officer's view is that there needs to be an exception process, and the exception is that it comes back through the chamber, and we've seen that many times with events. Yep, I hear the Mayor saying we don't want everything to have to come through here, but the reality is that budgets get spent, and if there's not enough in the budget, or it doesn't quite fit the budget, then the place to make that decision is in this chamber. And my final comments are around the funds and grants administered externally. My feeling is that is where we have some opportunities at the moment. I certainly see through submissions to the long-term plan that people have noted that funds and grants administered externally are protected in a way that funds and grants administered internally are not. And we're starting to see community groups look to move their funding into externally administered grants. And I have some support for that, because you all know I'm very supportive of our arts funding, and that was the funding that got cut last year. So it's no surprise to me that Pacifica Fusion isn't funded, because that's the fund that got cut, which would have supported that event. And so sometimes we reap what we sow. Thank you.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My thoughts are more in line with Councillor Bowen's than they are with the Mayor's, I have to say. I feel that this review is more about the transparency of the process, and they have said that they're looking to, one of the recommendations is to develop a change control framework, which would help with the process. And I think it's really important that we have transparency around all the money that we spend in this council. And it shouldn't be, a decision made by one or two people unless we've decided that that is a decision made by one or two people. So I feel like the recommendations that have been highlighted here are actually needed. And if we have issues with not having enough money to pay for the things that we want, then we do need to start looking at increasing funding for things like events and grants, or having discussions around the scope of different grants. But that's not what this is about. This is about the process of making those decisions. So I'm fully supportive of this review, and also that it's a start. This is a review. We can look at it. We can look at these recommendations and see what happens in the future. It's not giving control completely over to staff. It is looking at the process, and so that's the bit that I'm quite happy to see. And I'm also quite happy to see extra events appear in this chamber if needed, because we do that with pretty much everything anyway. When we run out of money for the arena, it comes back in here. When we run out of money for roading or whatever, it comes back in here. So if we run out of money for events and people really want events, it should come back in here. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Look, I'm really happy to support this. I think much has already been said by the previous two speakers. I think we do need really good policy around this. I think we do have a say in terms of the fact that we are the ones that determine the strategic aims and goals, but we shouldn't be the ones implementing those. So I think that I'm comfortable with what's been outlined in terms of the exceptions, and I do think it's healthier for exceptions to be, decisions around exceptions to be made by the full council rather than one or two elected members. Also in terms of the Smarty grants process, I've actually had some good feedback about that. I think with any change process, sometimes it takes a little bit the first time to get used to a new system, but I think it's certainly a lot preferable to the paper trail that happened prior to that. So I'm really happy with what's being proposed.
Councillor Harpeter.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks to the officers for putting the report together. I'm not in favour of the report. I think particularly for 2A, I think 2A is a real red herring for us, and particularly in response to a very competitive market when it comes to looking at major events for the city. I am really worried about those big events and worried about what we're going to lose and what other cities are going to pick up because we're going to lose them. So I do think that there are events out there that councillors, we're just going to lose. So I think that as a city, we're going to sit there and be picked off because these events are going to go to other cities because we're not going to be responsive enough, because particularly in the sporting area and in other areas, we're just going to sit back because we've got to go through a council process, because we've got to go through officers that are going to sit around and wait, and that's what really worries me. So I think this report is going to make sure that we sit around and wait. So I do think that it's very frustrating.
Councillor Finlay.
I'm going to be with the Mayor, and I won't support this. I look through this and I see it's just going to slow things down. We get an opportunity to come into the city and we got to act fast sometimes. And it brings millions of dollars into our city. And we're just going to hold it up. We're going to lose things, and I won't support this. And I look at 3B, and I'm confused more than anything else, where it says we don't have documentation, particularly with our continued services grants. We do have documentation. It was the decision of council to start them. There's order papers with that documentation. It's an order of council. You know, and to say we've got no track, and that goes back to the, goodness me, the early 90s. And I've seen, well, no, I haven't seen actually, but I've heard comments about how the application forms for even these grants have changed because there's so much information needed. Why does someone who's looking for a bit of money to help with the audit have to put a traffic management plan in? It's just, no, I'm sorry, I can't support this, and I won't support it. Thank you.
Mr Armstrong.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you for the report. Reflecting on this discussion, a lot of it, in my view, relates back to the scope of the piece of work that's been undertaken. And so, while I support looking at the existing processes and ensuring that they afford adequate protection, I'm also hearing that the efficiency of the current processes, which this document is reviewing, in some areas could be looked at, and I suspect that the exceptions policy might pick that up. Debates around where delegated authority should sit between this chamber and the officers, I think, is slightly outside of the scope of the existing review. So my comment would be, things come to this committee. It would be useful if before they came to the committee, when the work plan was presented, there was a more informed discussion of the scope and the intent of the piece of work. So if the intent is purely to look at the existing policies and processes and ensure that they provide sufficient checks and balances and control, that's one thing. But if the intent of the work is to look at the overall efficiency, are there better ways to triage things, should there be specific changes to delegations around that, then that's a different piece of work. So I think when these reports are coming to us, I would rather that as a committee we had discussed the scope and agreed on the scope up front and then got what we were asking for. So that would be a suggestion.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I've been in and out of the queue, sorry, as different people have spoken and said what I was going to say. I pulled myself out, but then I did just feel the need to comment on some of the later comments that have been made in this debate, because there's a bit of scaremongering going on here. What this is this is a report on how funds are being allocated and whether or not the decision-making around allocating those funds has been adequately documented. It's not about whether or not there's a contract for the event. And this is not the new process. This is the identification of a lack of process in some areas. The new process will be developed and brought back to us. And so, far from being threatened by the fact that holes have been identified and a new process will be proposed, we should be grateful to the officers for identifying the gap in our procedures. Because the more things are transparently accounted for and documented, the more accountable we are to the public for the funds that we spend. And so I don't see any threat in this report whatsoever. In fact, I welcome it. There are lots of very good things in it, some of which we haven't commented on, a couple of which I will comment on. So 1C, which I asked questions about, that will really give us a lot more of a direct line of sight into whether or not we're achieving with our community grants some of the strategic goals that we've set in the Connected Communities strategy. And the external, I think it's 3A, yes, the external sort of funding contracts, and we have had some issues this year with events that have been contracted externally. And whether we like it or not, the community sees responsibility with council, even when we've handed over the money to an external party and effectively have no legal responsibility. If things don't go according to plan, people come back to council. And so that is an area where I would welcome the additional financial security and the clarity as recommended in the report. So I think it's a very good report. I dare say it's a courageous report. It's not easy to come to the council chamber and say that this has been perceived political influence. But long before my time on council, there was perceived political influence in the administration of community grants to community organisations, and that was dealt with. And now community organisations receive grants in a very even-handed way. And I think what I would hope that comes out of the process that's developed from this report is a very even-handed way of allocating events funding. So I don't have any problem with it. And I find it strange that anyone would consider voting against an audit report, but you do what you have to do.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Naylor is the mover. Did you want to? Okay, so we'll now go to vote. Councillor Harpeter? Okay, and that is carried 13 votes for and 4 against. We are now going to break for morning tea. So if you'd like to come back, please, at 10:30. Okay, thank you. Right, it's 10:30, so back to our meeting. I just need to get myself organised. So we are now on to item number 8, which is the elected members' expenses and allowances policy on page 31, and I have Hannah presenting that report. Now, I am going to change a little bit how we do things. I have 6 amendments. And talking to some of you are not sure whether, after asking a question, whether you still want the amendment. So what I'm proposing to do is, after Hannah has spoken to the report, I will show you all the amendments, because they're all got movers and seconds, and if there's any questions you want to ask Hannah, you can ask Hannah. And some of you said, well, if you get, depending on the question, you might withdraw the amendment. So we'll do it in questions. So we'll go through each amendment just to ask questions. Once that process is finished, I am not going to allow any more questions in comments. So make sure you get Hannah to ask you questions while the amendments are up there. So you follow that? So Hannah, I'll pass across to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The report you have in front of you, members, is the genesis of this was a February resolution to review specifically 2 points in this policy, to consider whether we should include appointed members in our expenses policy and whether we needed to change our definition of council business. In general, at a wider picture level, the purpose of an expenses policy is to set out transparently the principles by which expenses can be claimed and allowances that are available to members, and to ensure that the spending of ratepayer money is prudent and is able to withstand public scrutiny. So to the 2 issues that, as I said, were the genesis of the report. The first one was whether we should include appointed members in our policy. So that's the specific answer to that is in 4.3 of the report. So the conclusion is that we should, or the recommendation is that it would be good to extend for training costs only and travel associated with training. The reason for that conclusion is appointed members are appointed for their knowledge and skill, and allowing training in their role would allow those appointed members to carry out their role effectively. I do not expect a significant update to or any necessity on the budget line in this space. Since February, when we had that one request for training by one of our appointed members, we haven't had any since then. I have one that I'm aware of in the next 6 months, but that's the entire extent of it. And in our previous 3-4 years going backwards, we have never spent more than the budget allocated for training, so I'm not concerned in that space. And the second point was whether we needed to retain or amend our definition of council business. The answer to that is set out in 4.5. The conclusion is that the definition as it stands is sufficiently broad. It is the definition used by most councils. I say most councils because if you do a search of all publicly available expenses policies, just about everyone uses this exact quote for the definition. There are the occasional rare example of something different, but it is the generally accepted definition. Tried and true, perhaps. The definition as it stands at the moment does include meetings with community groups. It also includes other justified purposes, business purposes, at the discretion of the CE. So I do believe it's sufficiently broad as it stands. I note also, actually since this report was compiled, that there have been recent requests through the Mayor's Office for functions relating to portfolio business, and that has been covered through our budget for support for elected members. So it hasn't been required as an expense claim, and I wonder if that might allay some of the concerns that members had in that space. If we did need, one of the other reasons for not changing it is that should we consider changing it and widening it even further, we would need to reconsider
the budget for elected member support. Obviously, when you undertake a review, you see things that you might not have otherwise, and it's an opportunity to step back and have a compliance check. Because of that, we are now including hearings fees. Hearings fees are not determined by us around the table, but the REM Authority does ask that we put those up publicly on our website, so we've included them in the policy. The other point that we've included for the purpose of compliance and was already publicly available in our annual report, but also now in the expenses policy, is the vehicle deductions for private use for the Mayor's vehicle. The other parts of a review, of course, are looking at whether the policy does reflect practice and practice reflects policy. And there have been several discussions with elected members in the space, particularly around meal costs when travelling. And I imagine that will be part of the debate today. Also, travel within the city boundaries and wanting to tighten the policy to reflect practice. Happy to start with questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So first up is Councillor Barrett.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Hannah, for the report. One question I had was just around the visibility back to the public, and I see that there's a commitment in there around reporting some elected members' expenses back, i.e. the mayor and the deputy mayor, but I didn't really see anything around other expenses being sort of regularly and routinely reported. So could you just outline what the reporting mechanism might be if members of the public were interested for other elected members, and
Sure.
also if there's a rationale around why some elected members and not others?
So current practice is that all elected member remuneration is reported through the annual report, which is a publicly available document. Definition of remuneration being your honorariums and also your communication allowances. And that definition is set by the Remuneration Authority. We do also collate what expense claims are received by elected members at the end of each financial year, and those are currently circulated in what we internally call the Friday Compendium, and are also sent out to the media annually. So all expenses are currently collated and available to the public.
Great, thank you.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Hannah. A couple of questions. Just following on from Councillor Barrett, the Friday compendium that is essentially public, that can be found on the website?
Yes, it's published in the same place as our agendas.
So it's essentially got the same level of accountability, except for the fact it just doesn't come through the chamber. It's just sort of immediately released when it's compiled.
That's correct.
Thank you. So just looking at the portfolio expenses, is that included in the Friday compendium, or is that included in actually, let me rephrase that. What accountability is there for portfolio expenses claimed?
At the moment, anything that comes through that budget line is signed off through myself, as per our usual 2 signatories on any expenses that are put through, any decisions around spending. So it's not a claim per se, it just goes through our normal spending. There's no reporting on that elected support budget line at the moment, other than as is available in general in the annual reporting.
Okay. How difficult would it be to include, and I don't know what it would look like specifically, but include something around accountability of those expenses through that Friday compendium with elected member expenses? I guess I'm just trying to be clear around if I had a portfolio and I was claiming for a packet of biscuits every week for all the meetings I was attending, how do other councillors know that $500 of the budget went to toffee pops? Do you know what I mean? Like how do we... Yeah. I don't have a portfolio, so I can use that example.
Sorry, through you, Madam Chair. We don't currently have a process for that, but it wouldn't be difficult to tag per portfolio and provide that information back.
Thank you. Just with the professional development and training policy, you and I have had some conversations offline around training matrix and identifying support for elected members in terms of upskilling and those sorts of things. But I note that the policy states that this would be reviewed at the beginning of a triennium. is there an intention that we would actually review this with a more intentional lens around how we could enhance the skills of elected members around the table before late 2022?
Absolutely. So the reason that the training policy is here today is it's appended simply because of the addition of appointed members. It hasn't been reviewed any further than that at this stage. But as the Deputy Mayor has alluded to in her question, I have been starting to have conversations around how we can adequately or better support elected members in their training needs. And I do believe it's timely that we do a proper review of the training policy, and it's my intention to do so before the beginning of the next training.
Perfect. That's all my questions at this stage. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I just have to find the page again now.
I'll come back to you, Councillor. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Hannah, for that. I apologise if some of my questions relate back to the workshop and recollections vary over time, and it's been quite some time since we had that workshop. I just want to go to a point you made about the definition of council business, and I do remember asking this at the workshops, where that definition came from. Now, you've said that lots of councils use it, but where does it come from? What is the genesis of that definition?
I do not know the answer to that, but I imagine there must be some ancient LGNZ advice because everyone is using it.
Yeah,
but sorry, I can't give you a clear answer.
But, so it's not in legislation. There's no legal requirement about that term. Okay, thank you. Question about 4.9. 4.10. This is about cell phones. In the policy, officers set out two options. You have a council-owned phone, or you have a personally owned phone. And there was some discussion around this in the workshop, because some of us have council-owned phones, but have our own contract. So we're not under a council contract. And that option seems to be missing in the policy. That what you seem to be suggesting is if you have a council phone, then you have to have a council contract. The only way to have your own contract is to have your own phone. Was that the intention?
I think the simple answer to your question is no, and I'm just going to direct you to the chart on page 41 of your papers. So the Remuneration Authority separates out two parts of mobile phone use. Mm-hmm. One is the actual use of the actual device, using it for the purpose, and the other is the cost of the plan to connect it. So the Remuneration Authority sets out a maximum annual allowance of $400 for the cost of the plan and $150 for the use of the phone. Mm-hmm. So if you were using a council device, then you would be foregoing that $150. Mm-hmm. But if you were paying for the plan, you would be claiming for the $400.
Right. But on page 41, the top part of the box, council provide elected members with a mobile phone contract and a laptop. What I'm saying is some of us have the mobile phone and the laptop, but not the contract. In the bottom part of the box, under the particulars, it's separated between home internet broadband connection, $400, and personal telephone plan mobile plan connection, $400. So the mobile plan connection is not included in the top box for if you've got a council mobile phone.
I could potentially make a third box for that particular situation. I think it's sufficient as it is. I can see the direction of the question. I do think it's sufficient as it is. The intention being that over time, officers would like to see elected members move towards using council devices and having council plans.
I think that direction comes through very strongly in the report. My point is that at the moment, we have options about how we choose to operate our own devices or use council devices, but at the moment, if you use a council phone, you can't be paid for your own personal contracts. I think you'll have some unintended consequences of people saying, I don't want a council phone if I can't have my own contract.
We could potentially change a small word in the heading above the second chart, which could allow for that without much difficulty. It's not the intention to prevent that from happening.
So what would be needed to make that change? Is that a minor amendment? Do we need a minor amendment
A
recommendation?
sentence along the lines of, through Madam Chair, if members choose to use their own phone and or phone plan and or laptop,
Yeah.
something along those.
Allowing some flexibility between those two options, absolutely. So that can be dealt with without a recommendation? Or you need a minor amendments recommendation?
I would rather do it as a recommendation, amendment.
Okay, I will write something
Because
down.
I've got so many amendments, I don't want to find that it's gone and somebody says that it didn't get done.
Thank you. I had a question about 4.14, which is about landlines. I think my question is, who in this day and age has a landline? And you seem to have taken away the need for elected members to use a landline in hotels, but surely we could just take away landlines altogether?
What page again was that?
4.14, landlines. In the report, not in the document. It's the 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, I've lost track of it. 1, 2, 3, 4. A bullet down, removing the ability to claim expenses for hotel landline calls. There's no longer required, as all elected members have access to a mobile phone. But in the mayor's expenses, we pay for the mayor's landline and toll calls. So how does the mayor need a landline when the rest of us don't need access to a landline? Well, that's his choice. He's allowed to choose to have a landline. I'm not saying he can't have one.
Isn't it just for hotels?
That is. But
The mayor does have different,
yes.
other than, you know,
Yes,
different.
that's what I said. I'm asking for just the rationale behind taking away, saying that elected members don't need to use a landline because they have a cell phone, but the mayor does need to use a landline and he has a cell phone. So what's the rationale there?
For the purposes of consistency, happy for elected members to put up an amendment.
Okay. And then this is my last one. It's something we discussed at the workshop, and I don't recall where we landed on it, which was just about in hearings fees for claiming expenses for post-meeting discussions for the purposes. And I remember you talking about how that's set by the Remuneration Authority. I just couldn't remember where we left that discussion. So could you clarify for me what was happening there?
The definitions around hearings, fees and payments are extremely complicated. They're not clear, they're very ambiguous. And we do our best to apply the advice that's given to us by the Rem Authority on a case-by-case basis. Elected members who are appointed to the hearings committee and are then appointed as commissioners on a panel make their own claim. They decide which category they think it falls into. And then we compare what each of the panel members has claimed for and make a fair decision based on that. But the key difference, I think, in understanding is the definition of a hearing is different to preparation. And so a post-hearing meeting isn't preparation. So it would have to be agreed that it was part of the hearing in order for it to be paid.
And I know that has been our practice in the past, so it was just tidying that up. Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
To you.
Thank you. Just looking at page 39, and it's an issue of consistency once again. In terms of travelling, in the top box, it talks about members can claim for the reasonable cost of travelling to and from events when on council business. And given that we're Palmerston North City Councillors, I assume that most of our council business is in Palmerston North. So what would you be thinking that reasonable cost was related to? Perhaps I'll carry on just to clarify. The next box down also says that taxis may... that taxis may be used on council business instead of private vehicles. So the implication is that the box above relates to the use of private vehicles, but then the next box down says that the vehicle mileage allowance is not payable in Palmerston North. So I guess I'm just wondering if it's not that clear in terms of the three statements at the beginning of each of those boxes sort of paints a different picture. And perhaps I'm not quite sure what the best solution to what seems to be an inconsistency is, but when you talked in your introduction, you talked about policy reflecting our practice. And I think that I understand that that last box may have been changed because I understand that no elected members actually claim for that, but it is an entitlement under the Remuneration Authority, as I understood it. That's why it was there to begin with. So if elected members aren't claiming for it, is that a reason in itself to remove the entitlement?
There were two quite significant questions there, so I'll try and go back to the first one first. So if I forget part way, please remind me.
That's fine.
I don't think those three statements are in contradiction. The top statement on page 39 is referring to any council business anywhere. It's not referring to just inside Palmerston North. And it's not referring to a particular mode of transport. It could be referring to personal vehicle, it could be a council vehicle, it could be a taxi. So I don't think that's contradictory to the other two statements. The discussion, your question around the change, and that statement is as it is in the current policy. That's not a change.
For the top two boxes?
Correct.
Yep.
Your second question, which is referring to the third box and is a change or is a recommended change, was part of the discussions that elected members had, and it was specifically to vehicle mileage, so that is when you are claiming on your personal vehicle. So if you were within Palmerston North boundary and you were doing a lot of travel for the purposes of council business, you could use a council vehicle for that purpose. Therefore, there's no need to claim on a personal vehicle. Your question about whether the REM Authority would allow someone to claim for personal vehicle usage, yes, the personal vehicle usage is allowed and can be claimed. So you're right, we're tightening it and saying that we wouldn't claim within the city. But those are always maximums at the REM Authority, they're not minimums.
Okay, so just one further question in terms of unpacking all of that. The second box where it says that taxis may be used for council business instead of private vehicles, could that result in unintended consequences that taxis can be used for travelling in Palmerston North, but not reimbursement for private vehicles?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think that's the very reason why that top sentence in the top box is necessary. It would need to be reasonable use of a taxi.
Okay, thank you. And just one further question. Obviously, the issues that were discussed in the workshop, many of those are included in this report. One of the suggestions that had been considered was that council wouldn't reimburse the cost of alcohol. That one hasn't been mentioned in this report, and I'm just wondering if you could elaborate why that hasn't been mentioned.
My recollection of the day that discussion happened was that elected members were not of one voice on that point. Thus, we've put up the current policy when it comes to alcohol, but available in the chamber to have that debate and put up any amendments.
Thanks, Hannah.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity just to follow up. Hannah, if I could take you back to the earlier question just around disclosure of expenses for other elected members. So just interested in whether it would need a formal amendment here to actually just clarify to members of the public that that is how the disclosure happens, so that they have, so this document's more useful to a member of the public if they go here and they go, here's the policy, where can I go to find the accountability? Does that need a formal amendment through this process?
I believe the chair directed that if we were going to add something else, that we would like it to be seen as an amendment.
Yes,
Yeah, we'll take that approach. Great, thank you.
thank you. I'd like to be consistent with that because there's so many amendments coming through. As I said, I don't want to get it lost. So before we start bringing up the amendments, I have no one in the queue for questions on the main document. Is there any further questions? Right. When Natalia's ready, I'm going to leave Hannah in the chairs. So we'll just, at this stage, we're not debating the amendments. We're just, if anybody has to ask a question for clarity. So we'll go, yep, just 2 minutes while they're coming in. Are there any other amendments before we carry on? Because I think we've got 11 now. So if you want to be home by 5 o'clock. Yes, please, so we get the right one.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had suggested that I was interested in looking at the meal allowance, and I put forward a recommendation for that. That's been dealt with in conversation. I'm not putting that amendment forward. Thank you.
Don't worry, if we get to it, we'll just flick it. So you're, okay. Okay, so the first one is up. That the words council will only pay for 2 beverages with an evening meal, alcoholic or non-alcoholic. Example, 2 glasses of wine / non-alcoholic, 2 cans of beer, etc., etc. Costs of alcohol are to be met by the member. So, any questions to Hannah on that one? Okay, that's straightforward. We'll go to number 2. Yeah, what we're doing is asking questions and then we're going to vote. We're not voting. This is just to get clarity. Yeah. You want that one withdrawn? Yep, so that one can go. The next one, that the words council has a fixed budget for elected and appointed members' training, a first in, first served approach is taken, be deleted and replaced with the words previous attendance and training needs are considered, as well as an equitable distribution of available funding. Any questions? Deputy Mayor.
My question was on the first amendment that had been put up.
That's only just popped up, So yes, you can ask a question on that.
My question is, Hannah, we talked about bringing this, the claimable allowance around meals in line with staff, and I'm wondering what the staff policy says around alcohol currently.
My understanding, because I've never claimed it, would you like to answer, Mr. CFO?
Yes, the current policy is 2 drinks with a meal.
Just 2 drinks?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Standard drinks.
Okay, thank you. No questions on 2, so we're up to number... Yeah. All expense claims by elected members are reported annually to Finance and Audit. Any questions? That should be straightforward. So number 4.
Excuse me, Madam Chair. Sorry, could we go back to the one previously? May I comment on it?
Number 2?
Yes.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. As referred to in one of the questions earlier, it is the intention of the Democracy and Governance team to review the training policy there's definitely room for improvement there. It would be my recommendation that we did a full review rather than made small amendments here and there at the moment. The reason for that is there is quite significant connection with the delegations manual as well, and wanting to make sure that everything is brought in line correctly.
Okay, thank you. So Councillor Naylor, do you want to continue with that? Okay, that's fine. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Hannah, can you explain to me where this first in, first served approach came from? Because this was the first time I'd ever seen it written down like that in one of our policies.
The training policy at the moment has a mix of comments which are inherently contradictory around how the training budget is divvied out. So this phrase, as crude as it is reflecting current practice. If you refer to the training policy itself, in the first paragraph, the objective is equal access. But then if you refer to the benefits of the program, the very first bullet point is about needs basis. And I think if we did a review of the policy, we'd certainly be looking at how training allows elected members to be effective at doing their job well. And I think we would find when we did that, that needs basis would become a priority. But that's not current practice.
But it is within the policy. So that's okay. That's a comment more than a question. You don't need to answer that. Thank you.
Excuse me, Madam Chair. I won't speak to this at this point, but it might be just helpful to point out that what is written there is not only in the training policy, but it's also in the expense policy. It's only in the expense policy, I'm sorry. So there's... have I explained that right?
No,
so
we'll come back to it.
Okay, it's on page 42.
Councillor Johnson.
Yes, so I've got a question about this.
Yes, that's fine.
So, Hannah, my understanding is that the first in, first served approach isn't current practice. Certainly when I consider some of the recent decisions that have been taken around who would go to a particular conference, the first in, first served approach hasn't been taken. So it's not even current practice, is it?
Reflecting on the direction of the question, it would be my advice that the phrase is ambiguous. The intention of the phrase was to refer to the budget itself, and when the budget was finished, it was finished, rather than the first member in. So I think that, this is not a good phrase.
I see where you're coming from with that now. Thank you.
Excuse me, Madam Chair. It's just that I can point out the answer to Councillor...
Are you wanting to continue with this one, Councillor, or withdraw it?
I'm going to continue with it, but I'm just going to point out that it's in red, so it's an officer's recommendation to be added into the policy on page 42. I just thought that might be helpful as an answer to the question.
Yep, gotcha. Okay. Sorry, I thought you were debating it. Right, we've done 2, so we've dealt with 3. So we're now on to 4. To add conflict of interest will be managed. Elected members wishing to attend a conference will not participate in decision making. Pages 42 and 53. Any questions on that? Okay, that's straightforward. We'll move on to, sorry, Hannah?
This amendment does specifically impact on delegations, and I wouldn't be able to, although I understand the intention of the amendment, or believe I do, I would need to go back and do some work about how it impacts delegations.
Okay, so standing at this point, we couldn't. So we'll have to come back to that.
Yeah, simply because I've got the delegations in front of me, and depending on the different type of training or conference, the delegation sits with a different position at the moment.
Okay. So we'll need to take that one out because it won't fit with delegations.
I'm sorry, I have a further question. I'm not wanting to remove it at this point, but I do have a further question.
Okay, well, you may ask it.
So when you say there's, it's different depending on which delegation, so what, can you just explain that?
So, for example, 189.2 specifically refers to the Local Government New Zealand Conference as sitting with a particular position, but other conferences sit with other positions as the current delegations stand. So a recommendation like this would have multiple delegation changes, which I wouldn't be able to give you advice on right now.
So what you're saying, that contradicts our delegation process, so, and we can't override the delegation process.
You can make a new delegation, but I would want you to be making that delegation with good advice, because it would mean there'd be several changes to delegations in order to make that work.
So can I ask, at the moment, there is the ability within the policy for the Mayor, Deputy Mayor and the Chairperson of the Finance and Audit to make those decisions. So there's 3 potential decision makers and only 2 need to make a decision. So I'm still a little bit unclear as to why that change couldn't be accommodated within the current.
So Delegation 190.1 at the moment does allow for the Mayor, the Deputy Mayor and the Finance and Audit Committee Chair, when either the Mayor or the Deputy Mayor is absent, to make that 2 of them make the decision. So that's already the delegation. But when it comes to the Local Government New Zealand Conference, the Finance and Audit Committee Chair is not included in the current delegation, and there are other such examples. So I would prefer to give you good advice so that you could make a change like this and make the appropriate delegations changes at the same time at a later date.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. That's answered, and it's up to you to either go with it or withdraw it.
Yep, just one further question. When is the delegations to be looked at?
This year.
This year, thank you.
So do you want to leave it in or take it out? Oh, okay. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I've got a question about this particular amendment.
Yes.
If this were passed today and the elected members in the delegations manual were not available to participate in decision-making because they wanted to attend a conference, who would then make the decision?
That's the conflict.
Well, this is why I'm asking, because in order to vote, if this remains in as an amendment, in order to vote on it, I need to know what the consequence would be. So there would be no delegated decision maker then, as we currently stand. Is that the answer?
The delegations would be in conflict with the Council's resolution.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hannah, as you read this amendment, if it was to pass and the Mayor was attending a conference in any capacity, that would remove him from participating in decision making?
I'm sorry, could you ask me that question again?
As you read this, it says elected members wishing to attend a conference will not participate in decision making. Therefore, if the Mayor was attending a conference, because I'm asking you, because staff will actually enact this, do you read this that the Mayor can then not participate in approval of elected members because he is an elected member attending that conference?
That is the intention that I understand when I read these words, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Bowen.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I've come in and out a fair few times on this one, but just on that last point, I think this recommendation is to this amendment is to a particular part of it's to the elected members' training, and the Mayor is not included in that part of the policy. The Mayor's training is dealt with separately under the Mayor's expenses. So it wasn't my understanding. So I just want to be clear about what the understanding is of this recommendation. And maybe that's more of a question to the mover, since I'm the seconder, I'm a bit confused. So I'm interested in why you think that would include the Mayor when this is an amendment to a part of the policy that doesn't include the Mayor. Yeah, then maybe that's it. The recommendation might need to be amended to be specific, but...
Madam Chair, I think that might be a question to the mover first.
Councillor Naylor?
It wasn't my intention for that to apply to the Mayor, because the Mayor does have a separate section of this policy that relates to him. So if I need to change the wording to clarify that, I'm happy to do that.
But point of clarification, Madam Chair. These amendments don't say what is being amended or what area of the policy is being amended. Are we able to, and perhaps we need to pause for a minute, but are we able to make sure that that's included so we have that clarification around where in the policy we're actually discussing? Because I think the last point has just highlighted that we're not on the same page.
It says on this one, pages 42 and 43.
So that is the...
Okay.
Right, so we'll move on for this one now. Oh, sorry, Hannah, I didn't see you.
If that's the case, then I've misunderstood, and page 42 is specifically referring only to councillor attendance.
Okay. Thank you. Right, so we'll move now to the next, number 5. So under 5, policy, imperative training, add, how do you pronounce that? Okay, that training. And under policy 5, desirable training and environmental, social, cultural and economic issues and challenges. I will learn to pronounce that word. So any...
There's a typo on the screen.
Which, sorry?
It's te tiriti, not te tiri.
Ah, okay. So we'll just...
No. D-I-R.
T-I-R-I. Titurity. That's better. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Councillor. Okay, are there any questions regarding this one? No. Hannah, you okay?
Only a similar comment to earlier, Madam Chair, just that if we were to review the policy, we'd be looking at taking away many items.
Okay, no, that's fine, thank you. Number 6. Item 8, recommendation 1, clause 4, separate meals costs will not be covered unless needed for dietary requirements. Any questions around that one?
Sorry, question to the mover. Could I please have a page number so I can check that?
Page 40, right at the bottom. So it's just adding at the bottom there where it says separate meal costs will not be met where a meal has been provided as part of training, conference, meeting, etc. Adding in there unless it's needed for dietary requirements.
Okay. That seems quite straightforward. Okay, number 7. Council will provide elected members with the option to claim a personal mobile plan connection with a council-provided mobile phone. So we've discussed that one before, so I think any further questions? Okay, number 8. That the expense and allowances policy be amended to include regular disclosure of expenses in categories 4, 6 and 7 via the council website. Any questions? Councillor Barrett.
Just to say, if we do take these in order, it was number 2 or 3 would actually take care of this, and we wouldn't need to consider it if it passes.
Okay, thank you. We'll note that when we did get to 2. Number 9. That council does not pay for the Mayor's home telephone rental and associated toll charges. Is there a seconder to this one? Okay, well that's gone because there's no seconder anyway. Okay, the next one. Councillor Barrett. Was that before? Oh, sorry, Councillor Naylor.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just going back one because I don't know what sections 4, 6 and 7 are and I just can't find them.
To number 8, was it?
Yeah, so I don't know if I have a question about that because I haven't actually, I don't quite
sorry.
know what it
Yep.
means.
Yeah, thanks. So that was just referring to the table of contents on page 37, and there's 11 items in the table of contents, and it's item 4, 6, and 7, which was easier than about the 20 words there.
And Councillor Johnson.
Just a process question, Madam Chair. Because of all of these amendments, and I'm aware of the standing order that says where an amendment is lost, the mover then can't propose another amendment. Has that been taken into consideration in the order in which we might do these? Because we might run into difficulty otherwise.
Yeah, we haven't thought that through yet because we're just going through, but we will follow that through. And I'm hoping there's going to be no further amendments. Right. Have we covered all the... Okay, we've covered all the amendments. Now, before we go to discussions, are there any final questions? Speak now or... Okay, so we're now going into the amendments. So we will start with amendment number 1 because that was a standalone. So I'll just give Natalia time. Okay, so that is moved by Councillor Naylor and seconded by Councillor Barrett. Councillor Naylor, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I can't remember how long ago it was. It's probably coming up a year ago that we sat around the table at the Convention Centre to try and work this policy out, and it was decided that it would be better to do that in a workshop. A number of us were quite uncomfortable with that because I think, I believe that transparency is really important, especially when we're making decisions that potentially may benefit ourselves personally. So then the discussion then in the workshop hasn't necessarily been well reflected in this report. So whilst I acknowledge that this was discussed in a workshop, and I think there were only 4 or 5 councillors that supported it at the time, I thought for the sake of transparency it was appropriate to bring it into this chamber where I believe all of the decisions around this should really be made in a transparent way. So I believe that the cost of alcohol is an unnecessary cost to be paid for by the ratepayers. That is becoming more of a widespread, commonly accepted approach by many large organisations that I've been involved with. It was interesting to listen to some of the discussion at morning tea time that reflected on the past around the council table in years gone by where there were spirits in the cupboard and all sorts of things. We've obviously moved on from this. This is going a step further to ensure that what we expect the ratepayers to pay for is reasonable, given, and particularly in the environment where we are asking them to pay more and more.
Councillor Barrett, did you?
Yeah, thanks. Just briefly to speak to my seconding of this, I do think it's reasonable to have the discussion here in the chamber and have the opportunity to vote here. Obviously a wide range of views around what is and isn't appropriate in this case. I do think that alcohol with a meal sits in the nice to have category rather than the need to have category, so we could look at covering that expense out of our own pocket rather than needing to pass that costs on to the community. I suppose the other thing that's in here is sort of the intent around moderation. Some people would say that 2 glasses of alcoholic beverage is perfectly moderate. But I think, again, I'm quite happy with just leaving those costs with members rather than trying to specify a level of moderation that then sort of translates into a signal to the community. So for those 2 reasons, I'm quite happy to support the amendment.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to oppose this amendment. Certainly when we had our workshop, the mood of the room was that we are all adults, and let's treat us like adults. I think it's up to individuals to determine what beverage they would like to have with an evening meal. I would use the words of Councillor Barrett and say that this is a moderate approach to assume that there'd be a couple of beverages of an individual's choosing, and that is more than appropriate to have. And I guess the other thing is that we had a discussion around bringing our meal allowance in line with the staff policy, certainly for consistency and the fact that there's parameters around what we provide for staff and bringing that in line, and this is standard in this organisation. So I think that actually if you're away at a conference and you're having dinner and you're having a glass of wine dinner, then that's more than reasonable. And so I'm going to oppose this amendment and would expect that it would be left the same.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and I can't really add anything to over and above what the Deputy Mayor has actually said. I will be opposing. Thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The first thing I just wanted to make reference when there was spirits in the cupboard, that was some time ago, just to leave the recording. In the early 2000s is what I would reference back to, not in any recent years. It's a long gone practice of this council, so don't get concerned. In fact, we were promoted back then as being a teetotaling council with the change, so, and perhaps proud to be since. But as far as this policy goes, I agree with the Deputy Mayor. I think consistency with the staff policy. I see the cost difference is very minimal compared to alcohol to a non-alcoholic drink, because it's not excluding that offering. And in the networking setting, we have the formality role as elected members, but we all have the networking and informal settings part of the post-conference or evening setting with other delegates of the event. And I think it's very acceptable, or acceptable at least, for my mind, to be able to have a casual drink over a meal with other delegates. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'll be supporting it. I don't think that anything in this amendment is forbidding elected members from having a glass of alcohol or being treated like an adult. But what it is doing is determining who might pay for that. And I don't think there's any justification in saying that ratepayers should pay for the alcoholic consumption of elected members. And certainly any organisation that I've worked for in the past, going back 20 years, there's always been a policy of not paying for alcohol for staff. And so I support this, and I think it's even more important when it's public money that's paying for it. So I'll be supportive.
Thank you, Councillor. No other further. Councillor Dingwall.
Sorry to jump in the queue very late. So I was thinking about not supporting this just so that we could have it in line with staff, but Councillor Johnson has actually managed to change my mind. So I completely agree with her in terms of the public not paying for alcohol, actually. And I think it's important that we actually start to set an example as well for our community. And we're not even just setting an example, we are following organisations who are setting examples. So I will be supporting this one.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll speak. I am not going to support this. I don't drink, so I'm not costing the ratepayers anything. But as far as costs go, it's negligible. I can go and buy a non-alcoholic cocktail under this policy when I'm in an Auckland hotel for $16. And somebody drinking a glass of wine is $8, so I think there's nothing to do with cost. So if we start with alcohol, then we're going to have to start with, you won't be allowed to go to KFC and change that because of the issues around the fat content. Are you going to stop me drinking my fizzy drinks because of the sugar content? So I think we just, it's up to councillors to decide what they need or don't need, and I think this is starting to be Big Brother stuff, so I'm not supporting it. Are there anybody else in the queue before Councillor Nailer's response? No, so you've got a right to reply, Councillor Nailer, if you wish. Okay, thank you. So we'll go to vote. So that has failed 11 votes for, 6 votes for and 11 against. So we go to amendment number 2. 1 down, 7 to go. Right. Councillor Naylor, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, thank you. So this is on page 42. It says
Sorry,
that
Councillor Naylor, just with process, because your first amendment failed, you need another for this, another mover for this.
Can we move to suspend that standing order, please? Because I think it's problematic.
Yep. Have a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Bowen, and we'll have to vote on that.
Yep.
So you're happy just to, yep. So the move is to suspend the standing orders.
Just that specific standing order?
Yes,
I haven't
just
got the
for
number.
this. Yep, that makes sense. But I have to follow process.
Yep.
Point of order, Madam Chair, just in respect, just for clarity, the person who's going to benefit from the change in standing order can't move it, perhaps? So it'll require another mover?
There's no standing order that a mover can't suspend standing orders. Which?
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Unless you point to the standard order that says that.
Would you like me to speak to that?
We'll just get it up first.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Councillor.
do we need to state the specific standing order, because it's 2.2.1?
Yes, they're bringing that
okay,
up,
that's
yes.
good. And we need 75%
Yes,
majority?
correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, when we get it up,
I'll explain. It's because there's a clause in standing orders that doesn't allow...
Yes, we do. Yes. Yep. So we need 13 votes for this to be. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Bowen. Okay.
Madam Chair, so a point of clarification. Do we really mean on the following item, or do we just mean on this report?
On this report.
Because we don't want to go through this for every recommendation.
Yes, so it's for all the items. Just put following items, and when that covers it. Put an S on the items. Yep, that's okay. Okay. So I don't think we need to, unless you want to speak to it, Councillor.
I'll just briefly explain, because so the standing order, this particular standing order hasn't been applied consistently anyway. And I do believe it's problematic, and I'd hope that next time we review standing orders, we may be able to address this so that it's not problematic. I think I understand its intention, which is to have a second or third go at the same issue, but what we're doing today are actually a number of different issues related to the same item. So I think it's appropriate to suspend that on this occasion.
Councillor Bowen, do you need to speak? Deputy Mayor. Oh, you're right. Okay, so we'll go to vote. And there has to be 75%, so. And that is carried 14 votes for and 13 against, so that is carried. Sorry, 3 against. Got to say, 27 council. Okay, so over to you, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. We'll just go to page 42. On page 42 in red, Officers have recommended to include a statement that says council had a fixed budget for elected and appointed members training and a first in, first served approach is taken. I'm suggesting that we remove that statement. I think others identified during the questioning that perhaps that's not necessarily been our policy, and I'm not sure if that's even been our practice or not, or what is actually considered when those decisions are made. But I think that's the whole point of some of these amendments, is that we do need to strengthen the process as it's outlined. So I'm suggesting to replace this with the words previous attendance and training needs are considered, as well as an equitable distribution of available funding. I think otherwise potentially there's the risk of someone putting in an application to go to 5 conferences at the expense of other elected members that perhaps then the money's run out. And I think it's appropriate that previous attendance and an equitable distribution of available funding is part of that consideration, as well as what the training needs are for that individual. I think absolutely there's a strong case for a new elected member to have more opportunities, and certainly I recall in my first year of being an elected member, I benefited greatly from going to a number of conferences, but we do need to weigh that up with ensuring that other elected members do have the opportunity to attend also.
Thank you. Councillor Bowen, did you want to see your second?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yep, just the officer clarified in response to questions that first in, first served was a reference to how the budget was approached, but even so, I find it an unfortunate turn of phrase that doesn't reflect our policy or practice, so I prefer the option that's been put forward.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to oppose this amendment because I don't agree with the final comment. I think the first in, first served approach is our current practice, and that I think that the officer did explain it. I'm not sure whether it was well understood that the way we practice currently is that when a conference comes forward for approval, we deal with that as they come forward, and that's what that first in, first serve approach is. We don't necessarily tag a certain amount of money to wait until 6 months down the track or those sorts of things. So that's how the first in, first serve approach currently operates. The previous attendance and training needs, I'm happy with that aspect, and that's current practice as well. I know certainly when decisions are made in the Mayor's office that we look at the spreadsheet that staff have got of training that's been undertaken. I think we look in over a 2-year period actually, and who's been to what recently, other considerations. The bit that doesn't sit well with me is the equitable distribution of available funding, and whilst in practice that sounds really lovely, we now have 21 members who are accessing 30 odd K for training, and if we look at that, then we're going to end up breaking down an individual, maybe a rough amount, but a allocation per elected member, when, as the mover has pointed out, in her first term of council she benefited greatly from multiple conferences, and I think that that's what needs to be taken into account. As we are all making up, as elected members, we're making up a mix of people who also wear other hats in the community. There are times when we have got more availability to attend things, and there are times that we have less availability. So certainly I know that in my first term on council I attended many things, and often that was because we needed somebody to represent the council and no one else was available. At that stage I didn't have commitments of children, whereas my time might be less flexible these days. So I don't like the idea that we are heading down a track where we might be allocating an individual budget to elected members. We need to be agile and responsive, and I think that this is becoming too restrictive. I'm comfortable with what is currently proposed. It is a reflection of current practice, albeit the wording may not be the best with that terminology of first and first served. It doesn't accurately describe how we apply that, and the previous attendance and training needs are already considered, though not necessarily stated. I would be more comfortable with referring this to the wider review, but at this stage I'm not supporting the amendment.
Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wasn't going to actually enter into any of this debate because it's somewhat, some of these are quite minor points. Look, what's up there actually happens now, and actually in the early part of our last financial year, hardly anybody put their name forward for anything, because we didn't really go to many things, and there was a lot of Zoom attendance, and look, I think the real issue here is a couple of extra elected members want to go to the local government conference. That's probably what we're dealing with here. Pretty well everybody that wants to go to something is catered for, but we've got a couple of members that want to go to the local government conference, and that's the end of story. We should put something up about that and really deal with the elephant in the room.
There's no further, so Councillor Naylor, you have a right of reply.
Thank you. Yes, a couple of things I would like to address. The word in the suggested wording is equitable, and I'd like elected members please not to get that confused with equal. It is quite different, and I thought about this, and my health colleagues will understand this terminology quite well, because we talk about equitable healthcare, and that doesn't mean that everyone has equal healthcare. It means that those who need it most actually get it. So what I'm proposing is not equal distribution of available funding. I'm suggesting equitable distribution of available funding. Just to the second point that the Mayor has talked about an elephant in the room, certainly that is not my reason for improving something. I think we should always look at opportunities to strengthen our policy, and certainly the wording that was proposed in here I wasn't comfortable with, and as the Mayor's pointed out, this is what happens now, so surely our policy should reflect our practice. So I'd urge you to support that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. So we'll now go to vote. And that has lost 9 votes for, 9 votes against, and 8 for, 9 votes against. Right, we now move on to number 3. Councillor Bowen, did you want to speak to?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, there's been a few comments about transparency being important in this. It just seems to me in the policy document at the moment we require the expenses of the Mayor and Deputy Mayor to be reported annually through Finance and Audit, and it would seem to be appropriate that all of our expenses are subject to that same transparency. Recognising that in the officer's comments she explained how these expenses are made publicly available, but I think we all know there's a difference between putting something on the website and bringing it through the chamber, and my preference would be to bring it through the chamber.
Councillor Harpeter, did you want to? Okay. There's no one in the queue, so happy to vote on that. And that is carried unanimously. So we now go to item number 4. And Councillor Naylor, you wish to speak?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I'm just finding it again. So I understand there's been a little bit of discussion around this and the broader picture of the fact that the intention is to review the training, professional development and training policy. I'm pleased to hear that. However, the clause that I'm wanting to address is also included in the expense policy, which we're trying to pin down today, and I'm assuming that we won't be re-looking at that in the near future. So in the part that I'm looking at again is on page 42, in red, where it says that the Mayor and Deputy Mayor, or if one of those is unavailable, the other acting conjointly with the Chairperson of the Finance and Audit Committee can approve elected and appointed members' training in New Zealand up to the value of $2,000. And I want to add in that the conflict of interest will be managed. My reason for doing that is that elected members who've been around for a few years will recall that the decision-making process prior to this policy coming into place was that those decisions all happened in this chamber, and that was quite time-consuming process. Every time anyone wanted to go to one conference, it came to this chamber. But what also happened during that process is that anyone who was putting their hand up for that conference actually stepped out of that discussion. So there was an ability for conflicts to be managed appropriately. Since the policy has been implemented and the decisions have perhaps gone behind closed doors, so to speak, I don't believe there's been included in our policy direction to be able to manage the conflicts of interest appropriately, and I think that needs to be introduced. So I'd like that to be introduced. I understand, so there it is on two places, page 42 in the expense policy, as well as page 53 in the professional development policy. I think that the detail around how those conflicts of interest will be managed may well be further fleshed out through the detail of the delegations policy, but I don't really want to just put this off until those other policies are in place. I think it's important that we do manage the conflicts of interest and that decisions are made in an appropriate way.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry. Did you need to go to the seconder?
It's all right. She came in after you and I didn't see her. Councillor Bowen.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I did pop in late. Just say I had seconded this and I absolutely support, as I'm sure we all do, managing conflicts of interest. But the answer to the questions about what the actual impact of this would be will mean that I can't support it. Because we can't have an inability to make a decision, and that was the officer's advice. So I would very much like to see this covered in the review of the policy and the consequential changes to the delegation authority be taken forward. But at the moment, I think we find ourselves getting the cart before the horse with this one.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I'm going to oppose this. I agree we're doing this around the wrong way. We have got a consideration at the moment for a training opportunity later in the year, which all three people in the delegations manual have expressed interest or are attending in other capacities, which would essentially mean that other elected members wouldn't have the opportunity because nobody could make the decision. So I think we need to get our delegations right before we start to review the detail. And as Councillor Bond said, I would expect that this would be referred to that review process. But I'll be opposing this.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm the same as you. I mean, we don't want to be left where we've got no one to be able to do the decision because the delegation's not there. There's no further... so back to you, Councillor Naylor.
Yeah, I hear that that's probably the most appropriate process is to refer that to the process, but in bringing it into the chamber here now, I'd hope that the spirit of what's intended here would be heeded to. I know it's been a discussion at our councillor only, and hopefully we'll get things tidied up for the future through those other mechanisms. Thank you.
Right, so we now go to vote. And that has lost 3 votes for, 14 against. So we now move on to item number 5. Are you requesting to? Okay, well, we'll vote again. Okay, no, we'll take the vote again because it's been requested. That's all right. So we'll disregard that vote and we're voting again, councillors. You just need a moment to reverse that. So, that is failed. 1 vote for and 16 against. So somebody else. Okay. Right, we'll now move on to next item. Which is item number 5. So, Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this one is in our training policy. I'll just flick to that. So under, on page, where do we start? Page 50, under 5, where it says policy, under imperative training, I think it's really important that we actually add in there that all council, all members should attend some sort of Te Tiriti or Waitangi training. That training it's vital for the work that we do here. And so it should be explicit that actually everyone should receive some sort of, should receive this training in the first place, because it affects every decision that we make. We need to be in partnership with iwi in a lot of things, and it's hard to do that if you're not even, if you don't even have the basic understanding of what Te Tiriti is and how it affects our decisions. So I think it's important to have that as imperative training and explicit in our policy. And then further down where it says desirable training, it says in there, it may include but not limited to community issues which address environmental, social and economic issues. Well, we know that there are 4 well-beings, so cultural should be included in there as well. So I'm wanting to add the word cultural into that piece. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, Councillor Johnson, you're the seconder.
Yes, I just think that despite the fact that officially the training policy isn't up for review at the moment, we've got an opportunity to make these amendments now, and I think they're not very controversial, and so I think we should take the opportunity to make them where we can, rather than wait for a review, which means the changes might not be made for some time.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. It's probably, and I didn't realise that. Is the word cultural not in there at the moment?
No.
Okay. I would have thought that the first one would be part of cultural. Because there is quite wide-ranging implications of adding all this in. We just need to be aware of that. I don't really have an issue with it, but I would have thought that would sort of already be coming under cultural. I don't have any issues with the cultural.
Can I comment or?
Sorry, I'm speaking at the moment.
Yep. Just let the Mayor, it's the Mayor's floor.
Yeah, thank you.
Mayor.
Could I ask the officers, is there a real difference here?
Yes, I was just going to, if Hannah can explain.
Thank you.
I need to say, Madam Chair, that the training policy as it stands at the moment has 3 separate sections entitled imperative, desirable, and I'm trying to think what the third one is off the top of my head. Thank you, developmental training. So, as I've understood it, Councillor Dingwall's proposal is to put Te Tiriti into imperative training and to put the term cultural into desirable training. So Te Tiriti is listed as one of basically the compulsory topics that elected members would need to have be trained in. And then Te Tiriti may also be covered in desirable training. There might be bicultural competency training, etc., under desirable training as well.
So covering both bases. Are you comfortable with that answer, Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, it is what it is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just there is quite wide-ranging.
That's okay, you can comment when we come to comments. Oh, did you want to finish your comment? Sorry, we are in comments.
Are we in comments now?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. Look, I don't have any, I mean, as the lead of council, I represent us at just about everything with iwi, and I have a great relationship personally with them. I just would like a little bit more time, rather than on the fly, from an amendment from the councillor, that we consider what we are signing up to. And I don't have, and I probably would make that call to sign up to it, but I just don't know what I'm signing up to. That's the problem. I'm amazed we haven't got cultural in there. So I almost want these split if we could, because there's two there. I would definitely back 100% the cultural training that is required. And I'm really surprised we didn't have that. And I think it's more than desirable. I think it should be imperative. But this is slightly different when we're signing up to the Te Tiriti o Waitangi training. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying we need to all understand exactly what we're signing up to. We're doing this somewhat on the fly, and I think it needs a wider discussion. It's just been shoved in there at the 11th hour. And so for that, I would absolutely require that a bit more. We need almost a bit of a report to understand what that means.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Look, I'm actually quite prepared to support both these changes within the training environment. Te Tiriti is just an absolute no-brainer in terms of being an imperative training for councillors. And the only other point I want to make is that just around cultural, that actually goes beyond Te Tiriti. It encompasses, it's a much wider view. So it's something which is desirable for councillors as well. So I'll be supporting both. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
As per Councillor Hancock.
Councillor Mickelard.
Oops, thanks, Madam Chair. And I think I'll be supporting this because I think it's important for us as community leaders to actually become culturally aware, especially leading, in this current climate or context where New Zealand is becoming increasingly diverse. And it's important for us to become culturally competent and culturally intelligent in relation to this. So I'll be supporting this because I think that in order for us to lead effectively and connect with stakeholders and colleagues from diverse racial background and or ethnic background, we do need to be culturally aware, and that is an important skill for us to have as elected members. So I'll be supporting this.
Thank you. There's no further comments, so back to you, Councillor Dingwall, right of reply.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the Mayor said, he was surprised to see that cultural wasn't included in this description. I would have to say that I'm quite surprised that cultural wasn't included in this section and that Te Tiriti or Waitangi training isn't included in our training as a basic standard of training for all elected members. You know, we are here in this country because of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. None of us around the table are actually Māori. So we all need to understand how us being here and making these decisions impact everything that we do and impact the future of our city. And that is really the basis of why we're here. So I think it's really important that we support having that as a basic, imperative, vital standard. We start with Te Tiriti or Waitangi training and everything else follows from that. And I think we need to be explicit in having that in our policy from the start.
The Mayor's asked for those to be split, so we will vote on those separately. So the first one, so we'll call that 5A. And vote when your comes up. And that is carried 16 votes for and 1 against. So we'll now have 5B. Councillor Naylor? And that is carried unanimously. Right, we'll now move on to item number 6. Councillor Dingwall.
Sorry, that one is back in the expenses policy. Let's just find it, sorry. On page 40, we're looking at meal allowance. And in there, it does say at the bottom, separate meal costs will not be met where a meal has been provided as part of training, conference, meeting, etc. I would like to add in the words, unless it is needed for dietary requirements. And the reasoning for that is sometimes we do find ourselves in conferences and in situations where, you know, we're there on council business, and through however it happens, sometimes it's an accident, sometimes a message doesn't get crossed, but they don't provide food for people with dietary requirements. And so I have been in many situations where I've been expected to eat fruit skewers, breakfast, lunch and dinner, and then at 11 o'clock run out to McDonald's to try and find something that I am allowed to eat. And that is quite a dangerous situation for me, actually. I know that there are people who have halal requirements. There are people who might be vegetarian. There are people, you know, there are many different dietary requirements. And if the facility does not provide for that, sure, we can go back and complain to that conference and say, you didn't provide the right food for me, we need a reimbursement, whatever. But actually, in the instance, when you are starving after the end of a long day, you need to be able to buy food. So that is why I've put this one up. And I ask for you to support it.
Councillor Johnson.
I don't think I need to add anything to that, thanks.
Okay, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just going to comment that obviously this is also taking into account that often you're out of town and you don't have the luxury of just pulling something together that you know is safe in your own home. And so whilst the gold standard is that our dietary requirements are passed on to conference organisers and those are met, that's not the reality many times. And so, yeah, I've got a lot of sympathy for this and absolutely full support for it.
Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, just to amplify some of those comments, this is a regular occurrence and one that we would do ourselves well to address.
Just one moment. Yes, you can speak to us.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to make an observation that needs to be considered. Often with some of these conferences and things like that, there can be side meetings and things that are at separate dinners, and I've seen that at LGNZ conferences and etc. So I just think we need to consider some of that when you're thinking about this. Of course, it's your decision.
Thank you. Right, there's no further...
Sorry, Madam Chair, point of clarification, just on the Chief Executive comment, if that's okay?
Yes.
Can I just check, are you alluding to the fact that whilst there might be a meal provided by a conference, if there's a meeting in another venue, then you may miss the meal? Are you talking about outside of just dietary requirements, or...?
Yes, I am, and often people may take this opportunity to meet with various councils about different things that may require you to pay for a meal. I'm just thinking that does happen.
Yes.
It happens at LGNZ, I know.
And can I just clarify that my understanding is that within the discretion of the approval that the Democracy and Governance Manager has, that if there was a claim put forward that there'd be discretion for that at the moment. Is that correct? Sorry, yes, the discretion would sit with you ultimately. Yeah. My apologies, but okay, thank you.
Okay, so we've got no further. So we are now going, Councillor Dingwall, did you want to? I think we've covered.
No, I think we've covered it.
Thank you. And so we'll now go to vote. And that is carried unanimously. Right, I believe we're on to the last one, are we? No. I know one's gone. So this is the last one.
Point of clarification, I had two up and I withdrew one, so I still have one that's there about the definition of council business.
We haven't got that one.
I emailed it through yesterday. You said you'd put it up.
We didn't go through it. Okay, I'm happy to, if you redo it, but yes, it didn't come up in the first 8. Okay, we'll go through this one. Council will provide elected members with the option to claim a personal mobile phone. So, Councillor, would you like to speak to this one first and then do your next one?
I've spoken to this. We're just trying to make it work.
Okay, that's all right. That's fine. Councillor Harpeter, you?
I think Councillor Bowen's spoken to this.
Okay. Does anybody want to comment? No. So we'll go to vote on this one and then we'll await. Councillor Johnson, you've come in.
I did just want to make a quick comment. If someone had their own personal mobile plan, would that save them from being in the position that the elected members were in last week when all of the apps on their phones were deleted?
It was a Microsoft problem.
Mine didn't go out.
So that wouldn't save the issue that the elected members had last week with their council phones? That wouldn't address it, I suppose?
No, it wouldn't.
Okay.
No. We're not in charge of Microsoft. Patrick, would you like to speak?
Through you, Madam Chair. At the minute, all council-provided mobile devices are installed with software to make sure that the device is secure and that the use of the device doesn't threaten the security of any of our internal systems. It's the mobile device management software that caused the issue with the apps last week. I would just want to confirm back with my team that if we provide a council-provided mobile phone for a personal connection, it would be my working assumption that we would simply be providing the phone, but not necessarily be providing the other technology that enables you to use other aspects of the phone on our council systems.
Sorry, could you clarify that last part? I don't understand what you're saying there.
So I'm sorry that this is new to me, but I would need to confirm that if we're providing you with a phone, we can provide you with a phone for you to use your own plan and for you to be able to access council IT systems such as email. I just want to check that we can do that, because at the minute all of our mobile phones are installed with software that's software to protect the security of the council.
Okay, thank you.
If you want to speak, please hit your button. Councillor Finlay.
Just that statement just then. I have a personal phone. I've always had a personal phone, but I get councillor email on that personal phone as it is. And I think all other councillors do as well.
Okay, well, let's stick to this amendment, please. And if you've got issues with your personal phone, Patrick's your man. We're now voting. We won't be a moment. Okay, and we're just going to vote for this one. So you can vote now, councillors. And that is carried 16 votes for and 1 against. Right, we will now move on to the last item, which we'll put up there. And I'll just read that out because this is an additional one to what we've already discussed, that the definition of council business include events attended in an official capacity, and that the sentence, it does not include events where the primary focus is on social activity, be removed. Councillor Bowen, have you got a seconder for this?
Councillor Harpeter was happy to second that, I think. That's what I emailed you about.
Councillor Dingwall is prepared to second it.
Councillor Dingwall. To speak to that, Madam Chair?
Yes, please.
Thank you. At the workshop, there was some discussion about the purpose of this policy, and the Democracy and Governance Manager spoke about how it was to enable clarity and ease of decision-making in deciding whether expenses were allowable or not. That the definition that we use of council business, as explored in questions, is historical and not based on anything in particular, and other councils do have different definitions, although this one is quite common. My suggestion that we change is to follow the form that it goes through. It's a list of things that are included in council business, and then adds on the end, but not social activity, which requires the officer to make a judgment about whether the event that you've applied for as part of council business is actually council business or is social activity. Whereas my view is very much that events where we're invited to attend in official capacity might have a social function to them, but the fact that you're invited in your official capacity means that you are at work. So it is council business. So, for example, we're all invited to attend the business event for stakeholders for the city's 150th. Now, that will be a beautiful social occasion, but it's also work. We're there in our official capacity. And so I think it's appropriate that that definition of council business includes events attended in an official capacity. Because the consequence of not including it means that you can't claim expenses for something that's not council business. So if you are at an event and you don't have use of a private vehicle and need to get a taxi home or some other form of transport, you can't claim for that if the thing that you're at is not council business. And that would seem to me to be an unintended consequence of excluding social activity from that definition and asking the officer to decide whether the thing that you've gone to wearing your badge is actually your work or not. I think that's a decision for elected members and not for officers. So I'd ask you to support that slight amendment to the definition. Thank you.
Councillor Dingwall, did you want to speak to that?
Thank you. So yes, I'm supporting these changes here, and I agree with what Councillor Bowen has said, and it's mainly because when I think about what I do day to day as an elected member, events actually comes up quite a lot. So I sit on the funding panel for creative communities, and often there are events that council funds that we end up getting tickets to and are expected to attend. Is that covered under council business, or is that the focus on social activity? I don't know, that's unclear, but this here makes it more clear, because there are times when we do actually have to go and attend, and we do wear our name badges, and we are there on an official capacity to represent council, but it is not the other explanations there. It's not council meetings, committee meetings, workshops, seminars, statutory hearings, training courses. You know, it's not any of that. It's an event. And it's not a social activity because you're there as a representative for the council. And just even in this last month, a couple of examples that I've had to attend are things like the Young Enterprise Scheme market. You know, that's a thing where it's quite good to have an elected member actually go there and, you know, say well done to the students participating in that program, but other elected members were at other events at that same time. So, you know, it's for me, it's another example was the Massey University Pacifica Graduate Celebration. That's a celebration. It's good for an elected member, particularly a Pacifica elected member, to attend those things in an official capacity. And so there are many things, fundraising events, award ceremonies, you know, that come up often. And it's important for us to be there. And I think the other side of things is when you're doing things like that, it does already say with the taxis that you can take a taxi home if you've attended an event. And so I think this here just brings those two in line a bit more and makes sense. So I would urge you to support that one.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I totally support the first part of this amendment, and I'm happy to include events attended in an official capacity. However, I'm not quite sure why it's necessary to remove the last part, the last sentence, which actually I do think provides some clarity to the definition. And the key word is that it does not include events where the primary focus is on a social event. And I think that's helpful to have that still in there. I'm not sure whether the mover or the seconder would be open to amending the amendment to just being the first half, but if they did, I'd be happy to support it. But I don't really see the value in removing that second sentence, which I think is actually a useful part of the definition to bring some clarity.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to say I'm quite comfortable supporting this, especially in light of the earlier disclosure and accountability measures that we've put in place. Anything that's done under this will come back through the Chamber and be reported, so I think it's quite reasonable that we do have an inclusive definition here, because absolutely there are relevant examples that are currently excluded from it.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're talking about, Councillor Dingwell spoke about stuff which I consider just as business as usual. We are talking about stuff in the city, aren't we? So this is city specific. No, it isn't. I'm getting heads being...
It doesn't clarify that, so it could be an event anywhere.
I think it should be city specific. Otherwise we'll get people flying here, there and everywhere. That is the unforeseen consequences of this. So, look, I don't disagree with it, and I think it is business as usual. I'm a little bit like Councillor Naylor, that the second part actually does give it some clarity, and it shouldn't be removed. But I'm happy to support this if that is changed and if it says something around in the city. Stuff that's outside the city, you attend. If it's an event that's been, Councillor Butt's gone to quite a few things for us around parliamentary stuff. Councillor Johnson's come to some refugee stuff. There's been stuff happened, but it normally comes to the city and via the Mayor's office. I'm just a little bit nervous this might just open the whole net.
So you as the mover, Councillor Bowen, do you want to put that change in or not? No. Okay, that's fine. Councillor Finlay.
We need to be a little bit careful. In the past, the system has been abused along the social situation. I can remember where one councillor had an argument and came to council and was given permission to go to a family iwi in Northland because she believed it was beneficial for the council to be representative. And she got that. And I do believe we need to be a little bit clear what we're doing here.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not going to support the amendment as it stands, and I'll wait for the right reply from the mover to see if there's any changes. Like the Mayor, I think this is opening up a bit too broadly, and I appreciate the level of accountability that's been passed through previous amendments, as Councillor Barrett's pointed out, but for me this broadens the scope far too wide. I think as soon as you're attending an event in an official capacity, you've been invited to something, and the example that Councillor Finlay's just used, whilst I certainly haven't heard of that. I think that does kind of give scope to those sorts of things. So I would support the inclusion of the second aspect that Councillor Naylor spoke to. It does not include events where the primary focus is on social activity. And I would support this if it was within the city or perhaps within the region. But I certainly don't think that this should be opened up to be a broad events attended in an official capacity. I know certainly from attending young elected member hui's over the last few years that there's often invitations extended to come and view projects or see pieces of work that have been really successful as examples that people may want to take back. And I just don't think actually we realise what we are opening up if we approve this as it stands, because I could go ahead and accept a handful of invitations to Queenstown and Auckland and all sorts of things that might be going to see useful things to bring back. But if I'm there in my official capacity, then all of a sudden this stuff is just funded. So I think there does need to be some parameters put around this. I absolutely accept it through the examples that Councillor Dingwall has given. My view is that the broadness of the existing definition already includes those, but I think that there might need to be some clarity, especially around things like support for taxis and those sorts of things, which is what I took from that. So as it stands, I'm going to oppose it. If the restriction, I guess, or capping is put in around this to be local events attended in an official capacity, or the sentence remains of it does not include events where the primary focus is on social activity, then I would be happy to support this, but not as it stands.
Thank you, Councillor. My comment is I agree. Deputy Mayor, I'm the same as the Deputy Mayor. There's nobody else on the queue, so I'll go back to you, Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just look to the seconder and ask, are you happy to remove the second half of that about the include events where the primary focus?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll just put a full stop after events attended in official capacity. Just to make a few comments on the subject raised.
Councillor Bowen, can I just, could we include city events?
No, we can't.
Okay,
and I'll
that's
explain
right.
why I'm not going
okay.
to do that.
Just, okay, that's fine.
So, what is council business? We each define individually as elected members, 16 of us with different interests, worldviews, portfolios, links into the community. None of us do this job in exactly the same way as the colleague sitting next to us. And the very broad definition of council business is intended to allow that, to enable that. Through this process, we've already increased the transparency around how we do this business and how we claim expenses for doing this, and I'm personally really pleased that we've got there. I think there's been a little bit of overreaction maybe to what I'm suggesting. I understand people's concern. I definitely don't anticipate that people will be flying here and there, but if they did, then there will be the belt and braces approach of the discretion of the chief executive to accept whether something is council business or not, which I'm sure she would have no hesitation in exercising. That's part of the policy. But I don't want to limit this just to the city for exactly the reasons the Mayor set out. We've seen just in the last 2 weeks members down in Wellington attending events in their official capacity. Why would they not be able to claim under our expenses policy for attending those parliamentary events? That would seem to me to be wrong. Obviously, most events happen within the city, and most times when this council is represented outside of the city, that quite properly sits with the office of the Mayor. And if he can't attend, then he might send somebody else. But that's not 100% of the time, and it would be incorrect to say that council business only happens within this city for all of our elected members. So I'm happy to leave that final statement about it not being social, if that makes people feel better about it. I personally think it's unnecessary, and I was taking it out because I feel it's redundant, but obviously others don't feel it's redundant. But I do think it's fair and accurate to include in our definition of council business that we attend events in an official capacity, because we do.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Dingwall, did you want to write a reply?
She doesn't get
Oh,
a
no,
right
she
reply.
doesn't. Sorry, it's nearly time for lunch. Okay, so there's no one else in the queue, so we're going to vote. And that has lost 8 votes for and 9 against. Right, councillors, after that little lot, we're going to break for lunch. We're going to vote. Yeah, we do. Thank you. We're voting on the substantive, so. Okay, it's in front of you, so does anybody want to speak to this? I have a mover. I need a mover and a seconder for this. Thank you, Councillor Barrett and Councillor Hancock. Councillor Barrett, you wish to speak?
Just briefly to say, I think that the work that we've done recently and the work that the officers did in the background has taken us some way forward, and obviously a few things a bit finely contested in terms of whether or not they would be adjusted in this round, but I think it sort of signals some areas where future efforts in ongoing maintenance of this policy might be focused. So it has been a helpful process and debate and discussion. A particular area that didn't get any attention that I think we might want to consider, and the reason that I raise it for future rounds is that I did a little bit of reading up on other councils' approaches. And some councils have some quite helpful, I think, guidance and specific language around when you have travel that is indeed on a council business, but then there is personal or non-council business associated with that as well. So the classic example might be the conference in Queenstown and then a couple days skiing. This policy actually seems to be silent in that sort of matter, and I think that next time we revisit it, I would hope that we also look at that aspect, because I do think it's valuable for the community to have that assurance and for us to have an agreed way of approaching those. But look, overall, I think it is definitely a step in the right direction, and happy to support it.
Thank you. Councillor Hancock, did you want to write a reply? Okay, Councillor Johnson.
I wonder if we could just have the amendments up to see all the amendments as well, because it says as amended, so we can see which ones have passed.
Okay, we'll just scroll through them, and we'll just give Councillor Naylor time to comment.
So can I also have my...
Oh, sorry, I thought you were just asking. Yes, of course you can.
Thank you. I do welcome the increased transparency that we've agreed through this process. And when this first came to council last year, it was substantially different from where it is now. And so I think the work that was done in the workshop and subsequently in the chamber this morning has been helpful. And whilst it's never an edifying sight to have people discussing their own expenses policy, at the same time I think we have reached an improved level of transparency over what is allowed and what isn't. And so I'll be supporting the recommendations. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I think Councillor Johnson's just said what I was intending to say, but the other quick thing that I'd like to add is just recognising that the budget, the overall budget for this has been reduced in recent years, hasn't been increased as subsequent to those reductions. And we've kind of based that on looking at last year, which was a COVID year where no one was sort of travelling. So I do think, given that we're adding in additional requirements for providing training and professional development to appointed members as well, I do think in the future that we may need to look at whether this is sufficient, but I'm comfortable with it as it is at the moment, but perhaps that may be something that needs to be monitored, and in particular given that not all elected members do have the opportunity within the current budget. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett, do you want to write a reply? I have no one else in the queue. Okay, so we'll just scroll through the amendment so everybody's comfortable with that. That's number 1. Number 2A. Five B or 2B. It's number 6. Right, there's number 7. Eight. Okay, so we'll now go to vote. And that is carried unanimously. So we'll now adjourn for lunch and we'll be back at 1:30. Phew, thank you.